So today I'm going to read you a story about Pepito. This is my favorite story from when I was a kid. It's called Pepito's Story. It's written and illustrated by Eugene Fern. Podingo was a little fishing town right by the sea. It was a wonderful place to live, especially for children because there were so many things to do. There was the sea to swim and fish in, the long sandy beaches to dig in, mountains to climb, trees to swing from, and even woods to hide in. So most of the children of Podingo spent their time swimming, fishing, and playing games, all except one little boy named Pepito. He was different. There was only one thing he really liked to do, and that was to dance. When he was dancing, Pepito felt as if he could be anything at all. He could be a king or a clown, a lion or a mouse, or a pirate with gold rings in his ears. He could be a seagull in flight or a blade of grass, or the wind itself when it blows on the sea. There was nothing he couldn't be when he was dancing. Was it any wonder he loved to dance? But in spite of his dancing, Pepito was not happy. The reason was simple. No one would dance with him, and so he was quite lonely. He made a rather funny sight dancing all by himself, and the children often laughed at him. This made him feel even worse, though he tried hard not to show it, and sometimes it was easier to run away and hide in the woods or on a lonely part of the beach. There was one person who understood Pepito, and that was his grandmother. She was a very old and wise as she was old. When Pepito felt particularly unhappy about being so different from the others and being laughed at, she would take him in her arms and repeat this little rhyme. If every child were like every other, you wouldn't know who was your sister or brother. And if every flower looked just the same, flower would have to be each flower's name. Pepito didn't know exactly what this meant, but somehow it always made him feel better. High on a hill in Podingo, there lived a very rich man named Don Escadrille and his only daughter Estrellita. Besides being a very rich man, Don Escadrille had just been made Lord Mayor of Podingo, and he was very pleased with himself. He thought nothing too good for himself or for Estrellita, whom he loved with all his heart. Now, Don Escadrille was a proud man, and much as he loved his daughter, he decided that it would not do for her to play with the children who lived by the sea and spent their time swimming, fishing, climbing on the rocks. She was the Lord Mayor's daughter and much too grand for such companions. And since there was no one good enough to play with her, she played with no one at all. Poor Estrellita. She had all the dolls and toys a girl could desire, and not a soul to share them with. Sometimes she would stand and look out her window at the sea, remembering the good times she had and playing with the other children before her father had become Lord Mayor of Podingo. Day after day went by until she became quite ill and had to be put to bed. Don Escadrille called in all sorts of doctors, but none of them could tell what the matter was, so all their remedies failed. The poor child grew thinner and weaker by the day. At last her father asked if there was anything at all he could do to make her feel better. Estrellita replied, "Yes, father, I would like to see my friends, the children who live by the sea." Without further ado, Don Escadrille set off for the town square. He gathered all the children together and told them of Estrellita's wish. He asked them to come to his house and urged each child to bring some gift to cheer her up. Perhaps if she had a real friend, he said to himself, she would try to get well. The children scurried off in all directions in search of presents. They loved Estrellita, and each child hoped that his gift would be the one to make her raise her head and smile. Only Pepito stood there uncertainly, wondering what to do. Pepito and his grandmother were very poor, and the boy could think of nothing he could give Estrellita as he trudged sadly home. Pepito remembered that he had a special reason for loving Estrellita. Of all the children in Pedingo, she alone had never made fun of his dancing. If only he could think of some way to help her. He thought, and when he could think no more, he started to cry. When his grandmother heard what the matter was, she said, "No doll or toy will make Estrellita well. What she needs is something very special, something you alone can give." And taking him in her arms, she repeated the little rhyme. If every child were like every other, you wouldn't know who was your sister or brother. And if every flower looked just the same, flower would have to be each flower's name. This time, Pepito nodded, for all at once he had an idea. Drying his eyes and standing up tall, Pepito marched up the hill that led to the home of Don Escadrille. He knocked firmly at the big front door, and soon he was standing in a hall filled with children, all holding in their arms the gifts they had brought for Estrellita. One by one, the children tiptoed into Estrellita's bedroom and presented their gifts. Estrellita thanked them all very nicely, and they tiptoed quietly out. Don Escadrille watched her face hopefully, but it was as sad and as pale as ever. Just then, in walked Pepito, alone as usual. His hands were empty, but he was smiling. He looked at Estrellita, quite lost in the big bed, her little face almost the color of the pillow. His dark eyes glowed with feeling, but he said nothing. Instead, he started to dance. Pepito danced as he had never danced before. Into his dancing he poured everything in his heart. The loneliness of the little girl living on the hill, his own loneliness among other children, his sorrow that she was sick, and his hope that she would soon be well and able to play with her friends again. As he danced, a strange thing happened. Estrellita began to smile, at first only with her eyes, but soon it was with her whole face. All of a sudden she laughed, clapped her hands, and sat up in bed. A moment later, she had thrown back the cover and jumped to the floor. No sooner was she on her feet than she began to dance with Pepito. Don Escadrille rubbed his eyes, but when he saw it was really true that his beloved daughter was well again, he was so overjoyed that he joined hands with the two children and began to dance himself. Never had the house on the hill been filled with such joy. The Lord Mayor was happy once more because Estrellita was well, and also because he had learned something, that no amount of presents can take the place of real friendship. From that night on, Estrellita could play with anyone she liked, and she was never lonely or sick again. She spent long days by the sea with her many friends, but most of all with her special friend, Pepito. As for Pepito, well, he was happiest of all, for he had learned that his dancing could bring people joy. He knew that each one of us has something all his own to give to the world, and at last he understood what his grandmother's little rhyme meant. If every child were like every other, you wouldn't know who was your sister or brother. And if every flower looked just the same, flower would have to be each flower's name. And he thought to himself, how dull that would be. I'm glad I'm a dancer. I'm glad to be me.